Hello. Excited to get started on this topic soon. Very, very excited about this topic. Looking forward to sharing my perspective. Also, looking forward to hear your perspective as well. We're talking about goal and outcome setting for leaders. Hopefully, we'll also talk a little bit about visions. Is there a difference between goal and outcome setting and all those good things? So we'll see what comes from the audience, but I'm really looking forward to tapping in and seeing what other people are sharing and hearing what other people have to share as well. As always, please feel free to comment, leave a thought. You're also welcome to connect with me in the DMs if you have any thoughts or anything you want to share on this topic. I really would love to hear it. We just want to wait a few more minutes to have a few people join us. But have you set your New Year resolutions yet? Would love to know also. Let me know. Do you set New Year resolutions? Is that something that resonates with you? I don't necessarily believe in New Year resolutions, but I do like using the beginning of the year to set goals, set visions, and really think about the behaviors I want to focus on for the next year or so. All right. So, welcome, welcome. I see we have one person in the audience. Really glad to have you here, Nicole. Glad to see you. We're actually just getting started. Usually wait a few more minutes for a few more people to join. If you would like to join me on this stage and share your perspective about goal setting, please feel free to raise your hand. I would be happy to have you up here and happy to hear your perspective. But just welcome. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me. Honestly, you could be anywhere. So I really appreciate that you are here. This is really meant to be an opportunity to connect, to learn, to share, to really have a conversation. And yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective on goal setting, maybe when we get a few more people in the room. In the meantime, I guess I can just do a quick introduction for those maybe who haven't had a chance to see any of my content or maybe don't know me. Hello, hi. My name is, I always spell it out, AKUA. I respond to Ikuya, Akua, or Aqua. I'm a certified executive and leadership coach, facilitator. I also speak. And really, what I do is support leaders through a three-step process where we're really just focusing on trying to, cultivate their self-awareness, really think about how they want to engage, and most importantly, how do they set expectations? And from my perspective, goal or outcome setting or even vision setting, whatever you sort of prefer describing it, that's really that expectation setting piece. And I think that that is incredibly key if you'd like to achieve anything. I think that that also is incredibly key if you are looking to lead others. So really just having an understanding of where you're trying to go, right? Being able to communicate that to others and holding yourself accountable, I think in different ways is also really important to keep in mind. All right. I see another person has joined us. Hello, Joko. Glad to have you. Glad to have you here. Excited to hear your perspective on goal setting and some of the things that maybe you've learned being an entrepreneur and also working more within the corporate space as well. If you want to join me on the stage, please just feel free to raise your hand. I'd love to have you on here. I was just doing a quick introduction and just also starting to talk a little bit about goal setting from my perspective. I have just a few pieces that I wanted to share, especially as it relates more to that brain side, especially as it relates to thinking about, goal setting in terms of sort of how we're wired as human beings. And I think that's always a really important topic or a really important thing to keep in mind. Hello, I see a few more people have joined us. Welcome, Emily. Hi, Dorcas. Glad to have you here. Once again, if you want to join me on stage to share your perspective on this topic, I'd love to hear it. I was just getting into sharing some of my thoughts around goal setting, especially as it relates to how our brain is wired. So especially as it relates to neuroscience, you know, from my perspective, the things I've been able to read, the research I've been able to see, goal setting is really a great way to help filter how you move through the world. Goal setting is really going to allow you to focus ultimately, right? And so when it comes to thinking about having that motivation, being open and willing to try and get outside your comfort zone, setting a goal can really help you do that. Some of the research I was looking at and I've used in some of the content I've put together for the work I do with leaders says that goal setting actually rewires our brain, right? So from a neuroscience point of view, goal setting allows us, and I sort of used this word before, but allows us really to filter through things to allow us to focus, right? And really help to increase that likelihood we're going to be able to achieve what we're looking to achieve. And I think also a key component of goal setting that we don't necessarily keep in mind that I think is important to note is that it's actually very emotional. As human beings, right, we are not logical. We are emotional beings. It's really about feelings, and we're constantly seeking these these specific sort of emotional feelings. And so when we achieve something or we work towards a goal, we might have a specific feeling. And a lot of times that's actually what we're seeking. We're seeking these specific, hormones, or we're seeking these specific feelings. And so keeping that in mind as you set your goals can also help you set more effective goals, because what you'll start to do is cultivate your awareness around what is it, what's that feeling, what's that emotion that I'm truly seeking. And that's something that I think a lot about, not just in my personal life, but also my professional life as well. And I think that, those of you who are leaders listening to this, that's something to also keep in mind as you're setting goals. When you're working with a member of your team, right, and you're trying to tell them whatever KPIs you have, OKRs you want to set, it's very important that they're able to connect it to themselves. They're able to connect it to their why. And if there's an emotional resonance to it, it actually will mean that it's going to be a lot easier for them to come up with specific tactics and strategies to help achieve that goal at the end of the day. So that's just some of the brain science or neuroscience that I wanted to share behind thinking about goal setting or outcome setting. Once again, whatever, sort of resonates with you. Some people like to focus a little bit more on thinking about it from the perspective of imagining where you're going. And there's also a lot of really interesting research really around if you're able to sort of imagine or envision yourself doing something, it ultimately would be easier to do it, right? Some very interesting research as it relates to athletes, especially. I think that's always very interesting to think about and look at, right? So just envisioning yourself doing something maybe you haven't done before, trying something, getting better at something will typically also lead to better results, because it sort of tricks our brains into feeling like, oh, I've done this before, so I can show up and do this again. Three things maybe I wanted to share a little bit more about goal setting from my perspective. And I'd love to hear, the perspective of some of you who are in the room, if any of you would like to share or have a perspective you'd like to share. So three basic things. And this also has to do with sort of how we're wired, how we tend to show up as human beings, how things sort of work for us typically, and also partially how we are, I guess you can say, raised or socialized as well. So the first thing I have on here is that we tend to underestimate how long something's going to take. So when it comes to setting goals or setting outcomes for ourselves, I think one thing to keep in mind is that we're not the best at planning. And if anything, most of us have an optimism bias. So, when we are thinking about especially delegating other tasks or thinking about things that need to happen in the future, it's really important that we create opportunities for us to check in with ourselves and support ourselves with systems to make sure things don't fall through the cracks, and we're constantly checking in to see whether or not we're actually making progress toward the goals that we've set for ourselves. And then we're thinking about this optimism bias, especially as it relates to the workplace. Another thing that we can keep in mind is that, if we are the ones who are making decisions about the time, energy, and resource predictions on behalf of our team members, it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of times we are actually a bit far removed from the reality of actually doing the work. And so when you are working with a team member to come up with KPIs and really trying to break them down into sort of tangible strategies, tactics, things they can do day to day, how they have to show up day to day, it's really important to get their input, and it's really important for them to be able to trust the process and once again be emotionally connected to it, and hopefully somewhat personally connected to it as well, because that's going to make it a lot easier for them to be motivated, for them to be engaged, and for them to see how they can have an impact on whatever everyone's working towards. I think that this first point that I shared around us just having this optimism bias, being terrible at planning and sort of underestimating how long things are going to take, is also related to the second one that I wanted to share, which is that, I've spent a lot of time working in the startup space, and I tend to also work with founders as well a lot of times, and we'll come up with what people call those big scary goals or those big audacious goals. And it's really great to sort of really push yourself and really challenge yourself. But at the same time, big can be incredibly scary. And so, a really important, I think, skill that a lot of leaders need to learn, and this is something that I share in a lot of the conversations I have with founders, is the importance of communicating goals at the right size and at the right scale to the right stakeholders, right? So, sharing big, scary, hairy goals or audacious goals with members of your team can actually be incredibly scary. And if anything, be demotivating, right? So sharing those big, hairy, scary goals with, someone who's looking to invest in you, that might really work for them. That might get them really excited. But for a member of your team who's actually going to do the work, it can be incredibly demotivating, especially if you don't take the time to break it down so they understand how they're going to actually work to make this a reality. Okay. So big is great. I think challenging is great, but it must be broken down, especially if the stakeholder is someone who's going to support you with that work. And especially if you're working within a startup and you don't feel like you have the resources to invest in someone maybe who has more experience breaking down bigger goals or breaking down bigger KPIs, OKRs to get things done. It's really important that at the end of the day, especially if you're working with more junior team members, that they have a clear understanding of what they actually need to do, what those steps might actually look like, what those behaviors potentially actually might look like as well, so that they're able to really be able to show up and get that done. Because if not, once again, it can be very demotivating and feel like no progress is being made if the goals are way too big and it's not something that they can really see themselves achieving, or the resources you have or you've given them can't help them get there, right? It's not going to be able to bridge the gap. So that's the second one that I always like to keep in mind, and I always love to share with my clients, whether or not they're within the startup space. This is something I also see in the corporate space as well, where they have these very big structured approaches to coming up with KPIs and OKRs, and they use all this amazing fancy software. Ultimately, I've worked with individuals where, they have a KPI or OKR, but they don't really have the resources, aren't given the resources to even implement that. So it's really something that you can really see across the board, and it's not just something that you see in the startup space. And this last one, once again, you'll see that all these three sort of thoughts I have in relation to really being able to set the goals that I feel, to set goals that are going to be motivating and really help you move forward, is really focusing on what you can control. And so once again, this is also related to this optimism bias that we tend to have as human beings, and how big can be scary, right? And how if a goal is really audacious and we don't take the time to break it down, how that actually can be very demotivating and, internally, turn us off and actually paralyze some people, right? They just get, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start potentially, right? That might be their reaction. And so with this concept or this idea of focus on what you can control as it relates to expectations, it's really important to recognize where you as an individual, or the individual that you're doing goal setting with or outcome setting with or setting KPIs with, that you're very clear on the element that they can actually do. And I always give sort of the quick example of sort of trying to get clients, right? And this is something I also think about in my business as well. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I need people to work with me so I can, I can live, right? That's what I do. I've been doing that for the last 5 years, but I don't have control over someone actually necessarily paying me, right? So to make a goal simply just an income goal, or simply just I work with a number of clients, is not the best way to move forward, right? So that can be a part of my goal. So part of my goal can be an income goal. A part of my goal can also be the number of clients. But what would probably be a more effective goal, a more motivating goal, a goal that actually helps me think about how I need to show up and behave day to day, is breaking down how often I reach out, right? Potentially some element of how I reach out, right? So what that copy is, what's included in the copy, how often I follow up, the energy I want to bring, how I want to show up when I'm, having these conversations. Those are the things that I actually can control, right? And the idea and the hope is by, connecting with specific types of people a certain number of times with a specific type of copy, and showing them the value that I provide, maybe from what I've done previously, hopefully that translates into clients being excited to work with me and investing in me, and then ultimately, right, hitting that revenue goal. All right. So that's I think some of the things that we sometimes need to think through, especially as we're goal setting with others, right? And this could also be if you have an employee and you'd like them to support you, making sure that you're very clear on the elements that they really can control, the things that they really can do differently day to day that's going to move the needle in whatever KPI you have, OKR you select, whatever you call it, right? Because ultimately, I see this across the board, from, some of, my own service provider friends to working within large corporates, right? This lack of clarity around who's really responsible and where can you really move the needle ultimately. So that's really all I wanted to share from my end. I see that there are a few people in the audience, so I'd love to hear the perspective of maybe a few of you that are on here. Does anyone have any questions, any thoughts they want to share from their perspective? All right. Really excited. I see Joko's raised her hand. Happy New Year, Joko.
Oh,
Glad to have you.
hi, Ikwa. How are you? Hello,
I'm good.
everyone.
How are you?
That's good. I'm fine, thank you. Um, oh God, my son is asking for milk at the same time. Okay, so I just wanted you to clarify your last point, really, about not just setting a revenue goal,
Yes.
but like what steps should you take? Sorry, because I mean I was following you, but I'm like, okay, I need you to please go back and just clarify that. So it's not enough to say I want to make, let's say, XYZ amount this year. Like, what else are we supposed to do with our team members? That, because you mentioned breaking it down into simpler steps that everybody says that this is what's going to thank you. This is what's going to help the bottom line. But what else can we do? You know, to help us achieve that goal that's within our control. Okay, baby.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kwa, I'm trying to
No,
do
not at all. I heard everything. And
Please, can
hello to
I
your
mute
super cute
myself?
son. Yes.
Yes.
Um,
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I don't know if there's anybody else on here that also would like to maybe share their perspective or have, maybe even potentially a different perspective from mine. I'd love to hear it. But yes, I do think, it is important to have a revenue goal. So I'm not saying not have a revenue goal, but I think that a lot of times, especially those of us who are, entrepreneurs and maybe working for ourselves, we get so focused on this revenue goal that we're not really thinking about the things that are going to move us towards getting or achieving that revenue goal. And so what I mean there is just really making sure that you've broken down, the pieces, especially if you work on a team, the pieces that each team is going to do to help to contribute to that. Because not every team is going to necessarily understand how them showing up in a specific way is going to help lead to that specific revenue goal. So a quick example that comes to mind is thinking about maybe a bigger business where, there's a specific revenue goal. Maybe you have, the sales team. It's maybe quite clear for the sales team that, how they show up, smiling to clients, connecting with a certain number of clients, following up with a certain number of clients. That's going to probably help to drive, right, that revenue goal. But they need additional support, right? They need that customer service team to maybe answer calls within a specific time, right? So maybe, the length of time it takes for customer service to respond to specific tickets. That could also potentially be a goal or KPI. Tickets need to be responded to within a specific time period because we feel that responding to tickets quicker will mean that, we're going to get more renewals and people are going to be even more excited to work with us, and we're going to be able to continue to retain those clients, right? What would that mean maybe for another team, right? So really just getting very clear on what role different teams can play and what that means for how they show up and ultimately behave. And I think sometimes what we forget is that behavior piece, maybe because we have systems already in place. We feel like, oh, well, they seem like they kind of work, or we see other people have done it or implemented it. And so we're not taking the time to be very curious, and we're not taking the time to really think about, is there another way, or is there potentially something missing, and most importantly, how can I make sure that whoever is on my team is truly connected to this in some way, right? So it could even go beyond, maybe the sales team, if we're thinking about them as an example, so they can see, right, how they show up, how that can have a direct correlation to whatever revenue you get. But maybe there's some additional underlying things that members of that team, or even just a member of that team, wants from being able to be a good salesperson, right? So it's also being able to tap into that and giving members of your team the opportunity to potentially express that as well. And that can also go a long way to help them be motivated, and to help bring them along, and also to help them do things maybe they never thought they would do. So Joko, I hope that was helpful. Once again, I don't know if anybody else has a perspective or anything that they want to share on that.
Yes, it was. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. So once again, just want to do a quick call out. Anyone else have a perspective or something they want to share in relation to goal setting? The second topic I did have for this conversation was really around thinking about goal setting formulas, method, tips, advice. I've shared a bit of my thoughts on this, right? So just really remembering that we have this natural optimism bias. So it's really important to keep in mind that we're not the best planners. So how can you come up with systems and make sure that you keep the people in mind that are actually going to be achieving these goals and helping you work toward these goals in mind, to make sure that there is no disconnect between what we think can happen and actually what happens, or at least that disconnect is as small as possible. The second was just keeping in mind that big, audacious, big, scary goals can be very demotivating and actually detract from moving forward and being able to get things done. And so it's really important to think about how to break down those goals. And the third piece in relation to that is really focusing on what you can control and making sure that your team has a clear understanding of how them showing up in a specific way will lead to specific results, whether in their personal or professional life. And being able to tap into both of those, I think, can actually be a really great way forward. All right. The last bit that I just wanted to share in a conversation today was really around goal setting apps, tracking software. Once again, I'd love to open it up and see, does anyone have any perspectives on this? Anything that they use to keep track of their goals or keep track of what they're doing, even with their team or within their business? All right. Well, happy to share my perspective also on this one. So I just use really, really, really simple. I would say as simple as Google Sheets, actually, to keep track of a lot of the work that I do. I also do use a CRM because the majority of my business is about relationships. So I also do have a CRM where I can keep track of the people I'm engaging with, keep track of the different projects I have, because things tend to go through email. So I use a CRM that works through my G Suite, and it works actually, I think, quite well, and is very helpful to keep me on track, and to keep me on top of the tasks that I have. When I work with external service providers, I typically will use what they find very helpful. And so I know other types of products or things that can help you stay on track of your goals could be things like Trello. I've used Trello in the past. I've also used Asana. But because my business is primarily done by me, I primarily just use Google Sheets, and now primarily using also OneNote to keep track of what needs to happen. And then I will check in every so often. So I tend to check in on a monthly basis. I also have some weekly trackers to keep track of my income, to keep track of my budget, and then also to keep track of numbers related to people who are applying or reaching out, and some other leads that I have as well. So I have separate trackers for that as well. And typically, what I'm always trying to do is just keep in mind, this is sort of what I set for myself. What do I need to, and this is something I ask myself on a monthly basis, what do I need to start, stop, and continue in order to move closer to the goals I've set for myself, or the vision that I've set for myself in relation to what I'm looking to do for the year. So I typically will sort of have a yearly sort of goal or yearly vision, and weekly, monthly, be checking in to make sure that I'm making progress. And if I'm not making progress, I'll ask myself, what do I need to start, what do I need to stop, and what do I need to continue. Once again, would love to see, would anyone else love to share their perspective or have any ideas on other ways to keep yourself on track? All right. Well, it doesn't seem like we have anybody else that'd like to join us on the stage or that would like to share their perspective. I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation and you got some tips and some ideas on the things that you can do to motivate yourself, motivate your team, some things to keep in mind in terms of how we're just wired as human beings and sort of how we're conditioned within the society that we're in as well. I also shared some goal setting formulas, and I also suggested some things that maybe you can keep in mind if you do want to stay on track and use software for it. As always, if you have any tips, any ideas, any thoughts, anything else that I missed or should add to this conversation, please feel free to leave a comment or to leave your thoughts. But thank you so much for joining, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day. Recording stopped. All right. Oh, I see that we just had someone join. Hi, we actually just ended